In debates about Germany's role in supporting Ukraine against Russia's invasion, a familiar argument resurfaces that Germany, because of its history in the Second World War, should exercise restraint in matters of war, especially in Eastern Europe. The instinct is understandable. The devastation unleashed by Nazi Germany across the continent, and particularly in the Soviet Union, demands a lasting moral reckoning. But history does not only caution against action, it also clarifies responsibility. And if we look more closely at where German war crimes were committed during World War II, a different conclusion emerges. One that challenges the idea that supporting Ukraine is a betrayal of historical responsibility. It may, in fact, be an expression of it.
Annalena Baerbock hat auf der Münchner Sicherheitskonferenz im Februar 2022 gesagt, wir können keine Waffen liefern, aus historischen Gründen. Da fragte ich mich schon, was denn für historische Gründe? Denn eigentlich ist ja die historische Verantwortung gegenüber der Ukraine noch größer als gegenüber Russland.
While the Eastern Front is often viewed as a single, undifferentiated space, the reality is more specific. A vast proportion of the territories occupied by Germany and ravaged in the fighting during Operation Barbarossa were not in Soviet Russia, but in what was then the Ukrainian and Belarusian Soviet Socialist republics. Ukrainian lands were among the primary sites of mass shootings, starvation policies, forced labor, and the systematic annihilation of entire communities. Cities like Kyiv, Kharkiv, and Odessa were not peripheral. They were central theaters of combat and destruction, and millions of Ukrainian civilians perished under occupation. To speak of German guilt in the East without recognizing Ukraine's central place in that suffering is to flatten history in a way that obscures more than it reveals. Ukraine was not only a site of occupation and atrocity, it was also one of the central battlegrounds of the war in Europe. Some of the largest and most consequential military operations of World War II unfolded on Ukrainian soil. The encirclement battles of 1941, including the massive German victory around Kyiv, resulted in hundreds of thousands of Soviet troops being captured, many of which were Ukrainian, not Russian. Kharkiv in particular became one of the most fiercely contested regions for a combination of strategic, geographic, and industrial reasons. The city was one of the Soviet Union's most important industrial centers. It was also a major road and rail communications hub connecting Crimea, Russia, and the oil-rich Caucasus, a key objective of Germany's 1942 summer offensive. Because both sides kept launching offensives through that corridor, the region became a cycle of attack, counterattack, and reoccupation. When Germany launched Operation Blue in 1942, it did so from Ukrainian territory. The occupation of Ukraine provided the Wehrmacht with a staging ground for its advance towards the Volga and the oil fields of the Caucasus, objectives that would culminate in the Battle of Stalingrad. These battles were not incidental. They shaped the course of the entire Eastern Front, and while most of the occupied territories in Soviet Russia had been liberated after the Battle of Kursk, it took the Red Army another year to drive all the German forces out of Ukraine. Germany formally dissolved the occupation regime of Ukraine on November 10, 1944. At the same time, that very occupation contributed to Germany's eventual defeat. The effort to control and exploit Ukraine stretched German supply lines across enormous distances. Partisan warfare intensified behind the front lines, disrupting logistics and tying down troops that might otherwise have been deployed at the front. In other words, Ukraine was not just a backdrop to the events elsewhere. It was a central arena in the Eastern Front, and its occupation had direct consequences for the trajectory of the war in 1942 and beyond. For decades, however, memory in Germany, and indeed across much of Europe, has often framed wartime guilt primarily in relation to Russia as the successor state of the Soviet Union. This framing, while rooted in the immense losses suffered by Soviet forces and civilians, has had the unintended effect of marginalizing other victims, including Ukrainians whose lands bore the brunt of German occupation and whose territories became the hinge on which the Red Army shifted momentum on the Eastern Front. This matters today because historical memory shapes political instinct. If Germany's sense of responsibility is directed primarily toward Russia, it can lead to a hesitancy to confront Russian aggression. This hesitancy is framed as a desire to avoid repeating past wrongs, but this interpretation risks a profound moral misalignment. Russia's invasion of Ukraine is not an echo of Germany's past crimes. It's an act of aggression in the present. Ukraine is not a proxy in someone else's historical narrative, but a sovereign country defending itself against a genocidal invasion. To suggest that Germany should withhold support in the name of historical caution is to misunderstand both history and responsibility.
Wir müssen selbst so stark sein, dass uns niemand angreift. Das gelingt, wenn Demokratien besser ausgerüstet, besser bewaffnet sind als Autokratien. Viele Millionen Ukrainerinnen und Ukrainer kämpfen nicht nur für ihre eigene Freiheit. Sie kämpfen auch für unsere Freiheit in Europa. Und dafür möchte ich Ihnen von dieser Stelle auch...
Historical responsibility doesn't consist solely in remembering past crimes or avoiding difficult decisions. It also involves in recognizing patterns of injustice and refusing to stand by when they recur in new forms. The lesson of the 20th century is not simply never again in the abstract. It is never again in response to concrete acts of aggression, dehumanization, and imperial ambition. There is also a deeper irony in the argument against German support for Ukraine. If Germany refrains from assisting a country whose people suffered immensely under Nazi occupation while citing its responsibility to avoid antagonizing the aggressor, it risks inverting the moral logic of its own history. None of this suggests that Germany should act recklessly or abandon its commitment to diplomacy, but it does mean that historical memory should not be used as a shield for inaction. On the contrary, it should sharpen moral clarity. Supporting Ukraine politically, economically, and even militarily is not a departure from Germany's post-war ethos. It's a continuation of it, grounded in the recognition that peace in Europe depends not only on restraint, but on the defense of sovereignty and human dignity. Germany's past does impose limits, but it also imposes obligations, and those obligations don't point away from Ukraine. They point directly toward it.
Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds.
Постріл!